I'm Alex, a college student who survived the first 24 hours of the Ice Age apocalypse. One October morning, New York City froze solid. Temperatures plummeted to 40-degree wildcards. I fought through blizzards, dodged falling ice, and raced to find shelter as civilization crumbled around me. This is how I stayed alive when the world turned to ice. Before we start the video, let us know what country you are tuning in from in the comment section below. Perhaps we will make a story there. Let's begin. It was just another Tuesday in October. I woke up at 7, like always, to my phone alarm blaring that annoying default tone. I remember hitting snooze twice before finally dragging myself out of bed. My dorm room was chilly, but that wasn't unusual for autumn in New York City. I shuffled to the window, rubbing sleep from my eyes, ready to gauge if I needed a light jacket or a heavy one for my trek to class. That's when I saw it. The world outside my window was white. Not just a light dusting of snow, but a thick blanket that covered everything in sight. Cars were barely visible lumps under the snow. The trees lining the street were bent under the weight of it, and it was still coming down hard. I blinked, sure I was seeing things. Snow in October wasn't unheard of, but this much? It didn't make sense. I grabbed my phone to check the weather app, thinking maybe I'd missed some big storm warning. That's when I noticed the temperature reading outside my window, 40-degree air. My heart started racing. This couldn't be right. It had to be a malfunction. But as I stared at the thermometer, the reality began to sink in. Something was very, very wrong. I turned on the TV. Flipping to a news channel, the anchor's face was grim as she reported on what they were calling a global freeze event. Temperatures worldwide had plummeted overnight. Major cities across the globe were buried in snow. Transportation systems were shut down. Power grids were failing. The gravity of the situation hit me like a punch to the gut. This wasn't just some freak snowstorm. This was a catastrophe. I could hear commotion in the hallway outside my room. Other students were waking up to this new frozen world. Panic was setting in. I heard someone shouting about trying to get home. Another person crying about not being able to reach their parents. I needed to act fast. I grabbed my backpack and started shoving in whatever warm clothes I could find. Thermal underwear, sweaters, my heavy winter coat. I put on multiple pairs of socks and my sturdiest boots. As an afterthought, I grabbed the emergency flashlight from my desk drawer and tossed it in the bag. Food. I needed food. I raided my mini fridge and snack stash, packing away everything non-perishable. It wasn't much. Some protein bars, a bag of trail mix, a few apples. I wished I'd stocked up more, but who could have predicted this? My hands were shaking as I tried to call my parents. The call wouldn't go through. I tried texting, but the message just sat there, undelivered. The cell networks must have been overwhelmed, or maybe they were already down. I took a deep breath, trying to calm myself. Panicking wouldn't help. I needed to think clearly. What was the next step? I couldn't stay in the dorm. If the power went out, we'd freeze. I needed to find better shelter. As I opened my door to leave, I nearly collided with my roommate Jake. He looked as shell-shocked as I felt. "Alex, what the hell is happening?" he asked, his voice trembling. I quickly filled him in on what I'd seen on the news. His face paled as I spoke. "We need to get out of here," I said. "Find somewhere safer." Jake nodded, then hesitated. "My girlfriend's dorm is just across campus. I need to make sure she's okay." I wanted to argue, to tell him it was too dangerous, but I understood. If it were my family nearby, I'd want to do the same. "Okay," I said, "but be careful. Meet me in the lobby in 10 minutes. If you're not there, I'm going to have to leave. Without you." He agreed and rushed off. I finished packing, adding a few more items I thought might be useful. A multi-tool, some hand warmers, a roll of duct tape. As I zipped up my backpack, I caught sight of myself in the mirror. The face, looking back at me, was scared but determined. I had to be strong. I had to survive this. I made my way down to the lobby, passing other students in various states of panic and preparation. Some were huddled in groups, trying to decide what to do. Others were frantically packing, like me. A few seemed to be in denial, insisting this was all some big mistake. In the lobby, chaos reigned. The resident advisor was trying to maintain order, shouting instructions that few seemed to be heeding. I caught snippets about staying calm, conserving food and water, and waiting for further instructions from the university. I checked my watch. Jake was late. I waited another 5 minutes, but he didn't show. My heart sank, but I knew I couldn't wait any longer. Every minute I delayed could mean the difference between life and death. With a deep breath, I pushed open the front door of the dorm and stepped out into the frozen world. The cold hit me like a physical force. Even through all my layers, I could feel it, biting at my skin. The snow was up to my knees, making each step a struggle. The wind whipped snow into my face, stinging my eyes and making it hard to see. I looked up and down the street, trying to get my bearings. The familiar landscape of the campus was transformed into an alien world of white. Buildings loomed like dark shadows against the swirling snow. There were a few other people out, trudging through the snow or huddled in doorways, looking as lost and scared as I felt. I needed a plan. Where could I go that would be safe? My mind raced through options. The library, too many windows. The gym, not enough food. Then I remembered something. I'd heard once about the Empire State Building Building being used as a shelter during past emergencies. It was a long shot, but it was the best idea I had. As I started making my way down the street, I heard a commotion behind me. A group of students were arguing loudly, their voices carried on the wind. "We need to get out of the city," one shouted. "Are you crazy? We'll freeze to death out there," another responded. "We'll freeze to death here too if we don't do something." I picked up my pace, not wanting to get involved. Their argument only reinforced my decision to find better shelter. The Empire State Building was miles away, but I had to try. The city was eerily quiet as I made my way through the streets. No traffic, no honking horns, no music from stores, just the howling of the wind and the occasional distant shout or siren. As I passed a convenience store, I saw the windows had been smashed. Inside, people were grabbing whatever they could. For a moment, I was tempted to join them. More supplies could only help. But then I saw a fight break out over a case of water, and I decided it wasn't worth the risk. I kept moving, my legs already aching from trudging through the deep snow. Every so often, I'd hear a loud crack and see snow and ice falling from buildings. Once, a large icicle crashed to the ground just feet in front of me. I realized then that the cold wasn't the only danger. The city itself was becoming a hazard. As I turned a corner, I came across a group huddled around a car. They had the hood up and were trying to get it started. I could hear the engine turning over, but it wouldn't catch. "It's no use," one of them said, slamming the hood down in frustration. "The fuel's probably frozen." I kept my distance, not wanting to get involved, but I couldn't help overhearing their conversation as I passed. "What do we do now?" a woman asked, her voice tight with fear. "I heard they're opening up the subways as emergency shelters," someone else said. "The subways? I hadn't even thought of that. It could be a good backup plan if I couldn't make it to the Empire State Building." I filed that information away just in case. As I continued on, the wind began to pick up, driving the snow harder into my face. I pulled my scarf up higher, leaving only my eyes exposed. My eyelashes were starting to freeze together, making it hard to blink. I was so focused on just putting one foot in front of the other that I almost didn't notice the figure huddled in a doorway ahead of me. As I got closer, I realized it was an old man, shivering violently. I hesitated. I didn't have much to spare, but I couldn't just leave him there. I approached cautiously. "Sir, are you okay?" I called out over the wind. He looked up at me, his face blue with cold. "I can't feel my legs," he managed to say through chattering teeth. I knew then that I couldn't leave him, but I also knew that staying here would likely mean death for both of us. I had to make a decision. "I'm heading to the Empire State Building," I told him. "They might have shelter there. Can you walk if I help you?" He nodded weakly. I helped him to his feet, letting him lean on me. Our progress was even slower now, but at least we were moving. As we struggled through the snow together, I couldn't help but wonder how many others were out there alone and freezing. How long would this last? And most terrifyingly, was this just the beginning of something even worse? The old man and I trudged through the snow-covered streets, each step a battle against the biting cold and howling wind. I could feel him trembling against me, his breath coming in ragged gasps. I knew we needed to find shelter soon, or he wouldn't make it. As we rounded a corner, I saw something that made my heart sink. A massive pile of snow and debris blocked the entire street. It must have fallen from one of the buildings, creating an impassable barrier. We'd have to find another route. "We need to turn back," I shouted over the wind to the old man. He nodded weakly, barely conscious at this point. As we retraced our steps, I noticed more people venturing out onto the streets. Some looked prepared, bundled up in layers of warm clothing and carrying backpacks. Others seemed to have rushed out in a panic, wearing little more than light jackets. I saw a woman trying to comfort a crying child, both of them shivering violently. The scene was surreal. New York City, usually so vibrant and full of life, was now a frozen wasteland. Abandoned cars littered the streets, some already buried under feet of snow. Store windows were dark, many of them shattered. In the distance, I heard what sounded like gunshots. The realization hit me hard. Society was already starting to break down. We passed a group of people huddled around a burning trash can, desperately trying to keep warm. One of them called out to us, "Hey, you two need to get inside. It's not safe out here." I nodded in acknowledgement, but kept moving. We couldn't stop now. The Empire State Building was our best hope for survival. As we continued on, I started to notice strange ice formations on the buildings. Long, twisted icicles hung from window ledges and fire escapes, some as thick as my arm. The rapid temperature drop was causing the moisture in the air to freeze instantly, creating bizarre and beautiful but deadly sculptures. Suddenly, there was a loud crack above us. I looked up just in time to see a massive sheet of ice breaking free from a building facade. Without thinking, I shoved the old man as hard as I could, sending us both tumbling into a snowbank. The ice crashed to the ground where we had been standing just moments before, shattering into 1,000 glittering shards. My heart was pounding as I helped the old man to his feet. That had been too close. We needed to be more careful. The city itself was becoming a death trap. As we continued our journey, I started to notice more and more people heading in the same direction as us. Word must have spread about the Empire State Building being a potential shelter. I felt a mix of relief and anxiety. Relief that we weren't alone in our plan, but anxiety about what would happen if too many people tried to crowd into the building. The wind was picking up even more now, driving the snow horizontally. Visibility was getting worse by the minute. I could barely see more than a few feet in front of me. The old man was leaning on me more heavily now, his steps becoming more unsteady. Just a little further, I encouraged him, though I had no idea how much further we actually had to go. The familiar landmarks of the city were hidden behind the veil of white, making it hard to gauge our progress. As we stumbled through the blizzard, I caught glimpses of the chaos unfolding around us. A group of people were fighting over a crate of bottled water they'd pulled from an abandoned delivery truck. In an alley, I saw someone huddled under a pile of cardboard, unmoving. I couldn't tell if they were alive or dead. The sound of breaking glass made me jump. I turned to see a man smashing the window of a pharmacy, reaching in to grab whatever he could. Our eyes met for a moment, and I saw a mix of desperation and shame in his face before he turned away, clutching his stolen goods to his chest. I wanted to judge him, to think I was better than that, but the truth was I didn't know how far I'd go to survive if things got bad enough. The thought scared me. We pressed on, the old man growing weaker with each step. I was practically dragging him now, his feet barely lifting from the snow. I knew we needed to find shelter soon, or he wouldn't make it. Just when I thought we couldn't go any further, I saw it. Through the swirling snow, the outline of the Empire State Building loomed before us. Relief flooded through me, giving me a second wind. We're almost there, I told the old man, not sure if he could even hear me at this point. Just a little further. As we got closer, I could see a crowd gathered at the base of the building. People were pushing and shoving, trying to get inside. Security guards were at the doors, attempting to maintain some semblance of order. I hesitated for a moment, unsure of how to proceed. The crowd looked dangerous, and in our weakened state, we could easily be trampled, but we had no other choice. This was our only hope for survival. Taking a deep breath, I steered us towards the crowd. As we got closer, I could hear the shouts and arguments. "Let us in. We'll freeze out here. There's no more room. Find somewhere else. You can't leave us out here to die." The desperation in their voices was palpable. I knew we had to find a way in, no matter what. As we approached the edge of the crowd, someone noticed us. A woman turned and saw the old man, barely conscious and leaning heavily on me. "Let them through," she shouted. "They need help." To my surprise, the crowd began to part. People stepped aside, creating a path for us to the front. I was moved by their compassion, a bright spot of humanity in this dark moment. We made it to the front, where a security guard was blocking the entrance. He looked at us skeptically. "Please," I said, my voice hoarse from the cold. "He won't survive much longer out here." The guard hesitated for a moment, then nodded. "All right, but just you two. We're already over capacity." As he stepped aside to let us in, I heard angry shouts from the crowd. I felt guilty for getting in when so many others were left outside, but I knew I had to focus on keeping the old man and myself alive. The warmth of the building hit me like a wave as we stepped inside. After the bitter cold outside, it felt almost uncomfortably hot. I could see people everywhere, huddled in groups on the floor, lining the walls, filling every available space. A woman in a Red Cross vest approached us. "Do you need medical attention?" she asked, eyeing the old man with concern. I nodded. "Yes, please. He's been out in the cold for too long." She guided us to a makeshift medical area where volunteers were tending to the injured and hypothermic. As they took the old man from me, I felt a wave of exhaustion wash over me. The adrenaline that had kept me going was wearing off, and the reality of what we'd just been through was starting to sink in. I found an empty spot against a wall and sank down, my legs finally giving out. As I sat there trying to process everything that had happened, I overheard snippets of conversations around me. They're saying this could last for months. I heard it's some kind of government experiment gone wrong. My cousin in Chicago said it's even worse there. The whole city is without power. I tried to tune out the rumors and speculation. Right. Now all that mattered was that we were safe and warm, but I couldn't shake the nagging feeling that this was just the beginning of our struggles. As I sat there, I noticed a group of people gathered around a small radio. They were listening intently, and I strained to hear what was being said. "Reports are coming in from around the globe," the announcer's voice crackled. "This appears to be a worldwide phenomenon. Scientists are baffled by the sudden and extreme drop in temperatures. There are unconfirmed reports of massive ice sheets forming over large parts of North America and Europe." I felt a chill run down my spine that had nothing to do with the cold outside. This wasn't just a freak storm or a temporary weather event. This was something much bigger, much more terrifying. A man sitting near me must have noticed my expression. "First time hearing the news?" he asked. I nodded, still trying to process what I'd heard. "It's crazy, isn't it?" he continued. "One day everything's normal, the next we're in the middle of a new ice age. Makes you wonder what else they're not telling us." I didn't respond. My mind was racing, trying to make sense of it all. How long would this last? How would we survive? What about my family, my friends? Were they safe? As these thoughts swirled in my head, I noticed a commotion near the entrance. The security guards were struggling to keep people out, but the crowd outside was growing more desperate and aggressive. "We need to barricade the doors," someone shouted. "They'll break through if we don't." Others began to move furniture, anything they could find, to block the entrance. entrances. I watched, feeling conflicted. On one hand, I understood the need to protect those of us inside. On the other, I couldn't help but think of all the people still out there, facing the same deadly cold we had just escaped. As I sat there, exhausted and overwhelmed, I realized that our ordeal was far from over. We might be safe for now, but what would happen when the food ran out, when the power failed, when the cold outside became too much for even this massive building to keep at bay? I looked around at the faces of the other survivors, seeing my own fear and uncertainty reflected back at me. We were all in this together now, strangers united by a catastrophe none of us could have imagined. As the noise of the crowd outside grew louder and the tension inside the building increased, I knew that the real challenge was just beginning. Surviving the cold was only the first hurdle. Now we had to figure out how to survive each other. As the hours passed in the Empire State Building, the initial relief of finding shelter gave way to a growing sense of unease. The lobby was packed with people, all of us refugees from the sudden freeze. The air was thick with tension and the mingled sense of damp clothing and fear. I couldn't stop thinking about the old man I'd helped. I hadn't seen him since the medical volunteers took him away. I hoped he was okay, but part of me was afraid to find out. In the span of a few hours, I'd gone from a regular college student to someone responsible for another person's life. The weight of that responsibility was overwhelming. As night fell, the temperature inside the building began to drop. The heating system wasn't designed to combat such extreme cold, and it was struggling to keep up. People huddled closer together, sharing blankets and body heat. I found myself sandwiched between a middle-aged woman and a teenager who couldn't have been more than 15. "I'm Marion," the woman said, her voice barely above a whisper. "That's Kevin." She nodded towards the teenager. "Alex," I replied. "Nice to meet you." "Well, under the circumstances." Marion gave a weak smile. "We were on our way to the airport when everything went crazy. Kevin's my nephew. We were supposed to be flying to Florida for his spring break." I nodded, not sure what to say. Our old plans, our old lives seemed so distant now. Kevin spoke up, his voice cracking slightly. "Do you think this is really the end of the world?" I looked at him, seeing the fear in his eyes. I wanted to reassure him, to tell him everything would be okay, but I couldn't bring myself to lie. "I don't know," I said honestly, "but we're alive, and we're here. That's something." As we talked, I noticed a group of people gathering near one of the windows. Curiosity got the better of me, and I excused myself to see what was happening. Pushing through the crowd, I finally got a view outside. What I saw made my blood run cold. The snow had stopped, but in its place, a thick layer of ice was forming on everything. Buildings, cars, even the bodies of those who hadn't made it to shelter were being encased in a glassy, transparent shell. "It's like the whole city is being frozen solid," someone murmured beside me. I couldn't tear my eyes away from the sight. It was beautiful in a terrifying way, like watching the world transform into some alien landscape. Suddenly, there was a loud crack. One of the ice-encrusted buildings across the street was starting to collapse under the weight. We all watched in horror as it crumbled, sending a wave of ice and debris cascading onto the street below. The crowd at the window quickly dispersed, many too scared to keep watching. But I stayed, transfixed by the destruction. It hit me then that even if we survived the cold, the city itself might not. How long before more buildings started to fall? How long before the Empire State Building, our sanctuary, succumbed to the same fate? I was jolted from these thoughts by a commotion near the main entrance. The barricade we'd built earlier was shaking. People outside were trying to break in. "They'll freeze out there," someone shouted. "If we let them in, we'll all die," another voice countered. The security guards were struggling to hold the door shut. I could hear desperate pleas from the other side, begging to be let in. Without thinking, I rushed over to help. I threw my weight against the door, feeling it shudder with each impact. From the other side, the wood was starting to splinter. "We can't hold it much longer," one of the guards yelled. Just as I thought the door would give way, a booming voice cut through the chaos. "Stand down, everyone, stand down." A tall man in a police uniform pushed through the crowd. He had an air of authority that seemed to calm the frenzy. "I know you're scared," he said, addressing both sides of the door. "But if we turn on each other, we're all dead. We need to work together." He turned to us. "We can't let everyone in. The building can't support it, but we can rotate. Let some people in to warm up, then they go back out so others can come in. It's not perfect, but it's the best we can do." There were murmurs of disagreement, but no one openly challenged him. Slowly, we eased off the door. The policeman who introduced himself as Officer Reeves organized a system. Groups of 10 would be allowed in for an hour at a time. As we implemented this plan, I couldn't help but feel a mix of relief and guilt. We were helping some people, yes, but we were also condemning others to face the deadly cold again. It felt like an impossible choice. The night wore on and exhaustion began to set in. I found a spot against a wall and tried to get some sleep, but rest was elusive. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw images of the collapsing building building, of the desperate faces of those still trapped outside. I must have dozed off at some point because I was jolted awake by a loud argument. Two men were shouting at each other, their faces red with anger. "You stole my food," one accused. "I didn't steal anything, you're crazy," the other shot back. Before anyone could intervene, the first man lunged at the other. They crashed to the ground, fists flying. Officer Reeves and a few others rushed to break up the fight, but the damage was done. People were on edge, eyeing each other with suspicion. Trust, already fragile, was fracturing. As the fighters were separated, I noticed Marion and Kevin huddled in a corner, looking terrified. I made my way over to them. "Are you okay?" I asked. Marion nodded, but Kevin was shaking. "I want to go home," he said, his voice small. I felt a lump in my throat. How could I explain to this kid that home might not exist anymore? That the world as we knew it had changed in ways we were only beginning to understand? Instead, I sat down next to them. "Tell me about Florida," I said to Kevin. "Where were you going to go?" As Kevin hesitantly began to talk about the beach trip they had planned, I saw some of the tension leave his body. It was a small distraction, but sometimes small things can make a big difference. As dawn broke, casting an eerie light through the iced-over windows, Officer Reeves called for everyone's attention. "We need to start rationing food and water," he announced. "We don't know how long we'll be here, and supplies are limited. We're also going to need volunteers for various tasks: medical assistance, food distribution, security. Anyone with relevant skills, please come forward." I hesitated for a moment, then stood up. I didn't have any special skills, but I knew I needed to do something, to be useful. "I can help," I said. "Whatever you need." Officer Reeves nodded appreciatively. "Good man. We'll need all the help we can get." As people began to organize into groups, I couldn't shake the feeling that this was just the beginning. We'd survived the initial shock of the freeze, but now we faced a different kind of challenge. How would we maintain order? How would we handle the inevitable conflicts over limited resources? I looked around at the faces of my fellow survivors. Some looked determined, others frightened, and still others seemed lost in shock. We were a microcosm of the world outside, diverse, conflicted, but ultimately in this together. As I moved to join one of the volunteer groups, I caught a glimpse of the old man I'd helped yesterday. He was awake, wrapped in blankets, but alive. Our eyes met, and he gave me a small nod of recognition. In that moment, I felt a spark of hope. If we could survive the first day of this new ice age, maybe, just maybe, we could find a way to keep going. But as I turned back to the task at hand, I couldn't ignore the nagging voice in the back of my mind. This was only day 2. How many more could we survive? And what kind of world would be left when, if, the ice finally receded? The enormity of our situation was overwhelming, but I forced myself to focus on the immediate tasks. One step at a time, one day at a time. That was the only way forward in this frozen new world. As the hours turned into days, life in the Empire State Building fell into a grim routine. I found myself working on the food distribution team, rationing out our dwindling supplies. It was hard, seeing the hope fade from people's eyes as their portions grew smaller each day. Officer Reeves had become our de facto leader, organizing us into shifts and teams. He was stern but fair, and his presence helped maintain a semblance of order, but I could see the strain on his face growing with each passing day. On the 4th day, as I was handing out meager portions of canned soup, a commotion near the entrance caught everyone's attention. A group had returned from a supply run and they looked shaken. "The ice," one of them gasped, her face pale. "It's getting thicker. Buildings are collapsing all over the city." A murmur of fear rippled through the crowd. I saw Officer Reeves approach the group, his brow furrowed with concern. "What else did you see out there?" he asked. The woman shook her head, her eyes wide. "It's like a ghost town. Anyone left out there, they're not moving anymore. They're just frozen in place like statues." I felt a chill run down my spine. The image of people frozen solid, their last moments of terror preserved in ice, was almost too much to bear. As the day wore on, the atmosphere in the building grew more tense. People were whispering, casting suspicious glances at one another. I overheard snippets of conversations, wild theories about what had caused this disaster. "It's government experiments gone wrong," one man insisted. "No," another argued. "It's aliens. They're terraforming the planet for themselves." I tried to tune out these conversations, focusing instead on my tasks, but it was hard to ignore the growing sense of desperation around me. That night, as I tried to sleep in my small corner of the lobby, I was awakened by a scream. I bolted upright, heart pounding. In the dim emergency lighting, I saw a woman pointing at one of the windows, her face a mask of horror. I rushed over, pushing through the crowd that had gathered. What I saw made my blood run cold. A hand was pressed against the glass from the outside, frozen in a plea for help. The ice had climbed higher up the building, trapping someone on the other side. Officer Reeves arrived quickly, a assessing the situation. "We can't open the window," he said grimly. "The cold would rush in. We'd all freeze." A man in the crowd spoke up, his voice shaking. "We can't just leave them out there." Reeves turned to him, his face hard. "They're already gone." Opening. That window would kill us all. The crowd fell silent, the weight of this cruel reality settling over us. I couldn't tear my eyes away from that frozen hand, a stark reminder of the fate that awaited us if our shelter failed. As dawn broke, casting an eerie light through the iced-over windows, I noticed something troubling. The emergency lights were dimmer than before. Our power was failing. I approached Officer Reeves with my observation. He nodded grimly. "I was afraid of this. The cold is affecting the generators. We need to conserve power as much as possible." We spent the morning turning off non-essential lights and devices. The darkness added to the already oppressive atmosphere. People huddled closer together for warmth and comfort. As I was helping to distribute blankets, I overheard a heated conversation between Officer Reeves and one of the building's maintenance workers. "The pipes are freezing," the worker was saying, his voice low but urgent. "If they burst, we'll lose water pressure. And if the ice reaches the foundations..." He didn't need to finish the sentence. We all knew what it meant. Our sanctuary wasn't as secure as we'd hoped. Later that day, I was approached by Marion, the woman I'd met on the first night. She looked haggard, her eyes red-rimmed from lack of sleep. "Have you seen Kevin?" she asked, her voice trembling. "I can't find him anywhere." My heart sank. In the chaos of the past few days, I'd lost track of them. "When did you last see him?" "Last night," she said. "He said he was going to look for more blankets, but he never came back." We searched the building, asking everyone we encountered if they'd seen the teenager, but no one had. As the hours passed without any sign of Kevin, a terrible thought began to form in my mind. What if he had tried to go outside? I shared my fears with Officer Reeves, who organized a small search party to check the immediate vicinity of the building. I volunteered to go despite the danger. I couldn't bear the thought of that kid freezing to death out there. Stepping outside was like entering another world. The cold hit me like a physical force, stealing my breath away. The city was unrecognizable, a landscape of ice and twisted metal. Buildings that had stood for decades were now crumbling under the weight of the ice. We searched for an hour, our movements slow and clumsy in our bulky cold weather gear, but there was no sign of Kevin. As we turned back, defeated, I caught a glimpse of something in the ice, a dark shape, human-sized, entombed in the frozen street. I couldn't bring myself to investigate closer. The thought that it might be Kevin or anyone else we knew was too much to bear. Back inside, I had to break the news to Marion. Her anguished sobs echoed through the lobby, a sound of pure despair that seemed to suck the last bit of hope from the air. That night, as I lay awake listening to the creaking of ice and the muffled cries of my fellow survivors, I couldn't shake the feeling that our situation was growing more dire by the hour. The Empire State Building, once a symbol of human achievement, now felt like a tomb. I must have drifted off eventually because I was jolted awake by a loud crack. For a moment I thought I was dreaming, but then I saw the panic on the faces around me and knew it was all too real. A large fissure had appeared in one of the walls, ice creeping through like pale fingers. The building was groaning, the sound of stressed metal filling the air. Officer Reeves was already on his feet shouting orders. "Everyone stay calm. We need to move to the central areas of the building, away from the outer walls." As we hurried to comply, I couldn't help but wonder, how much longer could we hold out? The ice was slowly but surely claiming our refuge. Each day brought new challenges, new horrors, and yet, as I helped guide people to safer areas, I felt a strange sense of purpose. In this frozen hell, every moment of survival was a victory. Every person I could help was a reminder that we weren't beaten yet. But as I looked at the faces around me, drawn with hunger and fear, I knew that our toughest challenges were still ahead. The ice had changed everything, and we were only beginning to understand the true scale of this disaster. The world outside was dead, frozen solid, and unless something changed soon, we would be joining it. Our only hope was to stick together, to pool our resources and our strength. But with supplies dwindling and tensions rising, I feared that our fragile community might shatter before the ice could claim us. As dawn broke on another frigid day, I found myself staring out at the frozen city, wondering what new horrors this day would bring. The Empire State Building creaked and groaned around us, a constant reminder that our shelter, like our old lives, was far from permanent. As days turned into a week, life in the Empire State Building became a delicate balance between survival and despair. The initial shock had worn off, replaced by a grim determination to keep going. But with each passing day, our situation grew more precarious. Food was becoming scarce. We had long since exhausted the vending machines and cafeteria supplies. The search parties that ventured out returned with less and less each time. The city was picked clean, and the intensifying cold made each expedition more dangerous than the last. I found myself on food distribution duty more often than not. It was a thankless job, watching hope fade from people's eyes as their portions grew smaller, but it was necessary, and I took some comfort in being useful. One morning, as I was handing out meager breakfast rations, I overheard a heated argument between Officer Reeves and Dr. Chen, one of the few medical professionals among us. "We can't keep going like this," Dr. Chen was saying, her voice low but intense. "People are starting to show signs of malnutrition. If we don't find find more food soon, we'll have bigger problems than just hunger. Officer Reeves ran a hand over his face, looking more worn than I'd ever seen him. I know, he said, but where? We've searched every building within safe reach. There's nothing left. Their conversation was interrupted by a commotion near the entrance. A search party had returned, and they looked excited. As they approached Reeves, I edged closer to listen. We found something, one of them said, breathless. A few blocks away, there's a grocery distribution center. It looks untouched. A murmur of excitement rippled through the crowd. Untouched supplies could mean the difference between life and death for all of us, but Reeves looked skeptical. If it's untouched, there's probably a reason. It could be dangerous. The man who had spoken nodded grimly. We think so too. The whole block around it is iced over worse than anything we've seen. Getting in would be a challenge. I watched as Reeves considered this information. I could see the weight of the decision on his shoulders. Risk lives to attempt a dangerous retrieval or watch us all slowly starve. Finally, he spoke. We'll send a team, volunteers only. Make sure they understand the risks. As he turned to organize the mission, I found myself stepping forward. I'll go, I said, surprising myself as much as anyone. Reeves looked at me for a long moment, then nodded. All right, gear up. You leave in an hour. As I prepared for the mission, I couldn't help but think about how much had changed. A week ago, I was just a college student worrying about exams. Now, I was volunteering for a potentially suicidal mission to save a building full of strangers. The team assembled. Quickly, 6 of us in total. We donned the warmest gear we could find and checked our equipment, ice picks, and ropes. As we prepared to leave, I caught sight of Marion watching us. Her eyes were hollow, still grieving for Kevin. I gave her a nod, trying to convey some reassurance. She managed a weak smile in return. Stepping outside was like entering another world. The cold hit us like a physical force, stealing our breath away. The city was unrecognizable, a twisted landscape of ice and metal. Buildings that had stood for decades were now collapsing under the weight of the freeze. We moved slowly, carefully picking our way through the icy terrain. Every step was treacherous, the ground a slick, uneven surface that threatened to send us sprawling with each movement. As we approached the grocery center, I understood why the previous team had been so wary. The entire block was encased in ice so thick it distorted the shapes of the buildings. It was like looking at the world through frosted glass. How are we supposed to get through that? One of the team members asked, voicing the question we were all thinking. Our team leader, a former construction worker named Mike, studied the ice wall thoughtfully. We'll have to chip our way through. It'll be slow going, but it's our only option. We set to work, taking turns with the ice picks. It was exhausting, grueling labor. The cold seeped through our protective gear, numbing our fingers and toes. But the thought of the supplies that might be waiting for us, of the lives we could save, kept us going. After what felt like hours, we finally broke through. The interior of the distribution center was dark and eerily quiet. Our flashlights revealed shelves stocked with canned goods, dried foods, and other non-perishables. It was more than we had dared to hope for. We worked quickly, filling our backpacks and any containers we could find. But as we were preparing to leave, a low rumble made us all freeze. What was that? Someone whispered. Before anyone could answer, the rumble came again, louder this time, and then we felt it, a tremor running through the ground beneath our feet. The ice, Mike said, his voice tight with fear. It's shifting. We need to get out of here, now. We didn't need to be told twice. We grabbed what we could and ran for the exit. But as we reached the hole we had chipped in the ice wall, we found it had already begun to close. Panic set in as we realized we were trapped. The rumbling was getting louder, the tremors more intense. The building around us was groaning, stressed by the movement of the ice. In that moment, as I looked at the frightened faces of my teammates, I thought about all the people back at the Empire State Building, people who were counting on us, who would starve without the supplies we carried. I thought about Marion, about Officer Reeves, about all the survivors who had become a strange kind of family over the past week, and I knew we couldn't give up. The roof, I shouted over the noise. If we can get to the roof, maybe we can find another way out. It was a desperate plan, but it was all we had. We raced through the building, climbing stairs as quickly as we could with our heavy loads. Behind us, we could hear the sound of ice cracking, of metal twisting. We burst onto the roof, gasping for breath in the frigid air. The view was terrifying. The entire block was shifting, buildings creaking and swaying as the ice moved beneath them. There, Mike pointed, the next building over. If we can jump the gap, we might be able to make it back to the street. It was insane. The gap between the buildings was at least 10 feet, a death sentence if we fell, but we had no other choice. One by one, we made the jump. My heart was pounding so hard I thought it might burst from my chest. When it was my turn, I took a deep breath, ran, and leaped with all my might. For a moment, I was airborne, the frozen city spread out beneath me. Then I hit the opposite roof hard, the impact knocking the wind out of me. But I was alive, and more importantly, I still had my pack full of supplies. We made our way down through the neighboring building and back to the street. The journey back to the Empire State Building was a blur of exhaustion and cold, but the thought of the lives we might have saved kept us going. When we finally staggered back into the lobby, we were met with cheers and tears of relief. As people unpacked the supplies, I saw hope rekindled in their eyes. We had bought ourselves ourselves more time, but as the excitement died down, I couldn't shake the memory of the shifting ice, of the buildings groaning under its weight. We had survived this time, but for how much longer? The ice was changing the very landscape of the city, and I feared it was only a matter of time before it reached us. As I collapsed into an exhausted sleep that night, my dreams were filled with visions of ice creeping ever closer, threatening to entomb us all. The battle for survival was far from over, and I couldn't help but wonder what new challenges the coming days would bring. The supplies we brought back from the grocery distribution center bought us some time, but it didn't solve all our problems. If anything, it highlighted just how precarious our situation was. The relief of having food was quickly overshadowed by new concerns. Officer Reeves called a meeting of the volunteer team leaders. I found myself included, my role in the supply run apparently earning me a place at the table. As we gathered in what used to be a conference room, I could see the strain on everyone's faces. "We've got food for now," Reeves began, "but we're facing new challenges. The building's infrastructure is failing faster than we anticipated." Dr. Chen spoke up, her usually calm demeanor cracking slightly. "The medical supplies are running low. We're seeing more cases of frostbite, and I'm worried about the spread of illness in these close quarters." Mike, who had led our supply run, added his own concerns. "The ice is changing the city's landscape. Buildings are collapsing, streets are disappearing. Each time we go out, it's harder to navigate." As I listened to their reports, a cold dread settled in my stomach. We were fighting a losing battle against nature itself. Reeves sighed heavily. "We need to consider evacuation. This building won't hold out forever." The room fell silent. The idea of leaving our shelter, of venturing out into that frozen wasteland was terrifying. But deep down, we all knew he was right. Where would we go? I found myself asking. Reeves spread out a map on the table. "There are reports of a government shelter being set up outside the city. It's a long shot, but it might be our best chance." As we discussed the possibilities, I couldn't help but think of all the people we'd be asking to make this journey. The elderly, the sick, the children. How many would we lose along the way? The meeting ended with more questions than answers, but one thing was clear. Changes were coming, whether we were ready for them or not. As I left the conference room, I nearly collided with Marion. She looked better than she had since Kevin's disappearance, but there was a new hardness in her eyes. "I heard them talking about evacuation," she said without preamble. "Is it true?" I hesitated, unsure how much I should reveal. But Marion deserved the truth. "We're considering it," I admitted. "The building might not be safe for much longer." She nodded, as if she'd been expecting this. "I want to help. If we're going to make it out there, we need to be prepared." Her determination surprised me, but I was glad for it. We needed all the help we could get. Over the next few days, we began discreet preparations for a possible evacuation. We sorted supplies, repaired cold weather gear, and tried to gather as much information as we could about conditions outside. But as we worked, tensions in the building began to rise. Rumors of the evacuation plan spread, causing fear and conflict among the survivors. Some demanded we leave immediately, while others refused to even consider abandoning our shelter. One evening, as I was helping to inventory our medical supplies, a fight broke out in the lobby. Two men were shouting at each other, their argument quickly turning physical. "We can't stay here," one yelled. "We're all going to die if we don't leave, and we'll all die out there," the other shot back. "At least in here we have a chance." I rushed to help break up the fight, but the damage was done. The fragile peace we'd maintained was shattered, and sides were being drawn. Officer Reeves did his best to calm the situation, but I could see the toll it was taking on him. The weight of leadership in this crisis was crushing, and I feared he was reaching his breaking point. That night, unable to sleep, I found myself wandering the darkened hallways of the building. The emergency lights cast eerie shadows, and the constant creaking of ice-stressed metal was a grim reminder of our predicament. As I turned a corner, I nearly ran into Dr. Chen. She looked exhausted, dark circles under her eyes. "Can't sleep either?" she asked with a weak smile. I shook my head. "Too much on my mind." She nodded in understanding. "I've been thinking about the evacuation," she said quietly. "There's something I haven't told the others yet." My heart sank. More bad news. "What is it?" Dr. Chen hesitated, then spoke in a low voice. "I've been monitoring the temperature changes. They're not natural. The rate of cooling, the way it's spreading, it doesn't make sense." I frowned, not quite understanding. "What are you saying?" "I'm saying that this isn't just some freak weather event. Something else is causing this. Something man-made. And if I'm right, that government shelter might not be what we think it is." Her words sent a chill down my spine that had nothing to do with the cold. If she was right, our situation was even more dire than we'd realized. Before I could respond, a loud crack echoed through the building, followed by screams. We rushed towards the sound, fear propelling us forward. We arrived at the lobby to find a scene of chaos. A large section of the ceiling had collapsed, bringing raining down a shower of ice and debris. People were scrambling to help those caught in the fall, while others stared in horror at the night sky now visible through the gaping hole. As we worked to rescue the injured, I couldn't shake Dr. Chen's words from my mind. If this freeze was man-made, who was responsible? And more importantly, could it be stopped? The next morning, Reeves called an emergency meeting. The collapse had forced our hand. We had to evacuate, and soon. We leave in 2 days, he announced to the assembled survivors. Pack only what you can carry. We have a long, dangerous journey ahead of us. The room erupted in a mix of fear, relief, and anger. But as I looked around at the faces of my fellow survivors, I saw something else too. Determination. We had come this far together, and we weren't going to give up now. As we began final preparations for the evacuation, I pulled Dr. Chen aside and told her about my conversation with Reeves. She agreed that he needed to know her suspicions. When we shared our concerns with Reeves, his face grew even more grim. If you're right, he said slowly, then we're walking into unknown territory. But we don't have a choice. We can't stay here. I nodded, understanding the impossible decision he faced. Lead us into potential danger, or stay and face certain death. As the evacuation day approached, I found myself taking one last look around the Empire State Building. This place had been our refuge, our prison, and our home. Leaving it felt like the end of something, but I hoped it was also the beginning. The night before we were set to leave, I couldn't sleep. I made my way to one of the windows, looking out at the frozen city. The moon cast an eerie light over the ice-covered landscape, making it look almost beautiful in its desolation. I heard footsteps behind me and turned to see Marion. She joined me at the window, her face a mix of fear and resolve. Do you think we'll make it? She asked quietly. I wanted to reassure her, to say yes with certainty. But after everything we'd been through, false hope seemed cruel. I don't know, I admitted, but I know we have to try. She nodded, seeming to appreciate the honesty. We stood in silence for a while, watching the moonlight glint off the ice. Kevin would have been excited about this, Marion said suddenly. He always loved adventure. I put a hand on her shoulder, not knowing what to say. She gave me a small smile, then turned and walked away, leaving me alone with my thoughts. As dawn broke, on evacuation day, the lobby was a flurry of activity. People were checking supplies, adjusting their cold weather gear, saying goodbye to the place that had sheltered us for so long. Reeves gathered us all for one final briefing. The journey will be dangerous, he said, his voice carrying across the crowded room. We'll face cold like we've never experienced, treacherous terrain and unknown threats, but together we have a chance. As he spoke, I looked around at my fellow survivors. Faces that had been strangers just weeks ago now felt like family. We had been through hell together, and we were about to face even greater challenges. But as Reeves finished his speech and we prepared to step out into the frozen world, I felt a glimmer of hope. We had survived this far against impossible odds. Whatever awaited us out there, we would face it together. With a final look at our temporary home, we opened the doors and stepped out into the unknown. The bitter cold hit us immediately, a stark reminder of the world we were venturing into. But as we began our journey, moving as one through the icy streets of New York, I couldn't help but feel that this was just the beginning of our story. The frozen city loomed around us, silent and imposing, but we were alive, we were moving, and for now, that had to be enough. Whatever lay ahead, whatever secrets we might uncover about the cause of this frozen apocalypse, we would face it, because in this new world, survival wasn't just about staying alive, it was about finding a reason to keep living. As we marched forward into the white expanse, leaving behind the familiar silhouette of the Empire State Building, I realized that our true test was just beginning. The Ice Age had changed everything, but it hadn't broken us. Not yet. And as long as we had each other, there was hope. Our exodus from the Empire State Building was like something out of a nightmare. The bitter cold bit through our layers of clothing, and the wind whipped snow and ice into our faces, making it hard to see more than a few feet ahead. We moved slowly, our group stretching out in a long line as we navigated the treacherous, icy streets. Officer Reeves led the way, using a map he'd marked with the safest route out of the city. But the landscape had changed so much since the freeze that navigation was a constant challenge. Streets we thought we knew were unrecognizable, buried under feet of ice and snow. Entire buildings had collapsed, creating new obstacles we had to carefully maneuver around. I found myself near the middle of the group, helping those who struggled with the difficult terrain. Marion was close by, her face set in grim determination as she helped an elderly woman over a particularly slippery patch of ice. As we made our way through the frozen wasteland that had once been New York City, I couldn't help but marvel at the eerie beauty of our surroundings. Familiar landmarks were transformed into crystalline sculptures, the ice creating fantastic shapes and formations. But the beauty was deceptive, hiding deadly dangers at every turn. We had been moving for several hours when I heard a shout from up ahead. Rushing forward, I saw that one of our group had fallen through a thin patch of ice, disappearing into the darkness below. Several people were already working to pull him out, but the ice kept breaking under their weight. Without thinking, I lay flat on my stomach and inched forward, distributing my weight as evenly as possible. I managed to grab the man's hand just as he was about to slip under again. With the help of others, we were able to haul him him out, but the incident left us all shaken. "We need to be more careful," Reeves said, his voice tight with stress. "The ice is unpredictable. From now on, we move in pairs, tied together. If one falls, the other can anchor them." As we implemented this new system, I found myself paired with Dr. Chen. As we walked, she shared more of her theories about the cause of the freeze. "I've been thinking about the rate of temperature drop," she said quietly. "It's too rapid to be natural, and the way it's spreading, it's almost like it's being directed." "Directed?" I asked, not sure I understood. "You mean like a weapon?" She nodded grimly. "It's possible, which makes me wonder about this government shelter we're heading towards. If this is some kind of weapon test gone wrong, can we trust them?" Her words sent a chill through me that had nothing to do with the cold. If she was right, we might be walking into even greater danger. But what choice did we have? As night fell, we were forced to make camp. We huddled together in small groups, using our body heat to stay warm. Sleep was fitful, interrupted by the constant cracking and groaning of the ice around us. The next morning, we awoke to a changed world. During the night, the ice had shifted, creating new chasms and barriers. Our planned route was now impassable. Reeves gathered the group leaders to discuss our options. "We can try to find a way around," he said, pointing to the map, "but it'll add days to our journey. Or we can try to cross here, but it's risky." We debated back and forth, each option carrying its own dangers. In the end, we decided to attempt the crossing. The thought of spending extra days in this frozen hell was too much to bear. As we approached the newly formed ice canyon, I felt my heart racing. The gap was at least 30 feet across, with sheer ice walls dropping into darkness. We had some climbing gear, but not nearly enough for everyone. "We'll have to create a rope bridge," Mike, our resident construction expert, said. "It's not ideal, but it's our best shot." For the next few hours, we worked tirelessly to set up the makeshift bridge. It was slow, dangerous work. Twice, we nearly lost people to the icy depths below, but finally it was ready. Crossing the bridge was one of the most terrifying experiences of my life. The rope swayed with each step, and the wind threatened to tear us off at any moment. I focused on putting one foot in front of the other, not daring to look down at the abyss below. When the last person made it across safely, a cheer went up from the group. We had overcome our first major obstacle, but as I looked at the exhausted faces around me, I knew we still had a long way to go. As we continued our journey, the cityscape gradually gave way to suburbs, and then to more open terrain, but the cold remained constant, an ever-present enemy that sapped our strength and resolve. Food was becoming a serious concern. Despite rationing, our supplies were running low. We sent out small hunting parties, but in this frozen wasteland there was little to be found. The few animals we did encounter were desperate and dangerous, more likely to attack us than become prey. On the 5th day of our journey, disaster struck. We were crossing a frozen lake when the ice suddenly gave way beneath us. In a matter of seconds, a dozen people were in the water, fighting for their lives in the freezing depths. The next few minutes were chaos. Those of us still on solid ice worked frantically to pull people out, but the cold water was deadly, and despite our best efforts, we lost 3 of our group that day. The mood that night was somber. We had known the journey would be dangerous, but the reality of our losses hit hard. As I helped dig shallow graves in the frozen ground, I couldn't help but wonder how many more we would lose before we reached safety, if we ever did. Marion found me later as I sat staring into the small fire we had managed to build. "You did everything you could," she said softly, placing a hand on my shoulder. I nodded, not trusting myself to speak. The weight of our situation was crushing, and for the first time since this ordeal began, I felt truly hopeless. But as I looked around at our battered but determined group, I realized that giving up wasn't an option. We had come too far, endured too much. We owed it to those we had lost to keep going, to find a way to survive this frozen hell. The next morning, as we prepared to move out, Reeves gathered us all together. "I know yesterday was hard," he said, his voice carrying across the group, "but we can't give up. Every step we take is a step towards survival. We honor our fallen by living, by fighting on." His words seemed to light a fire in the group. As we set out, there was a new determination in our steps. We had faced the worst the ice could throw at us, and we were still here, still moving forward. As we traveled, we began to see signs of other survivors, abandoned camps, messages left in the ice. It gave us hope that we weren't alone, that there might still be a world beyond this endless white. But not all signs were encouraging. We came across a group that had frozen to death in their sleep, huddled together for warmth that never came. It was a grim reminder of what awaited us if we failed. On the 10th day of our journey, we crested a hill and saw something that made our hearts soar. In the distance, we could make out structures, signs of life. Could this be the government shelter we had been searching for? As we drew closer, our excitement turned to caution. The compound was surrounded by high walls, and we could see armed guards patrolling the perimeter. This didn't look like a rescue center. It looked more like a military base. Dr. Chen's words came back to me, her suspicions about the true nature of this shelter. As we approached the gates, I couldn't shake the feeling that we might be walking into something far more complicated than we had anticipated. Reeves stepped forward to speak with the guards. As they talked, I saw his body language change, becoming tense and defensive. Something was wrong. When he returned to the group, his face was grim. "They'll let us in," he said, "but there are conditions. They want to separate us, put us through processing before we can enter the main compound." A murmur of unease rippled through the group. After everything we had been through together, the thought of being separated was terrifying. "What if we refuse?" someone asked. Reeves shook his head. "They made it clear that it's their way or no way, and we're in no condition to go back out there." As we debated what to do, I caught Dr. Chen's eye. She gave me a small nod, confirming my fears. Whatever was going on here, it wasn't as simple as a rescue operation. In the end, we had no choice. We were out of food, exhausted, and the temperature was dropping again. We had to take the risk. As we were led through the gates, I took one last look at the frozen world behind us. We had survived the ice, but I had a feeling our greatest challenges were still ahead. Whatever secrets this compound held, whatever had caused this frozen apocalypse, we were about to find out, and I couldn't shake the feeling that the answers might be more terrifying than the ice we were leaving behind. The processing center was a stark clinical environment that felt worlds away from the frozen wasteland outside. We were separated into groups, men and women, adults and children. The fear and uncertainty were palpable as we were led down sterile corridors. I found myself in a room with about 20 other men. We were instructed to strip and shower, our frozen, filthy clothes taken away. The warm water was a shock to my system after so long in the cold, but it also made me realize just how exhausted I was. After the shower, we were given new clothes, simple uniform jumpsuits that reminded me uncomfortably of prison attire. Then came the medical examinations. Doctors in hazmat suits poked and prodded us, took blood samples, and asked endless questions about our exposure to the cold. Throughout it all, I couldn't shake the feeling that we were being studied rather than helped. The doctors' questions seemed too pointed, too specific. They were particularly interested in how we had survived the extreme cold for so long. As I waited for the examinations to finish, I struck up a conversation with the man next to me, a former truck driver named Ray. "Something's not right here," he muttered, eyeing the guards at the door. "Why all the secrecy? If this is a rescue operation, why does it feel like we're prisoners?" I nodded, sharing his unease. "Have you noticed how interested they are in our survival? It's like they're surprised we made it." Ray's eyes widened slightly. "You don't think they expected us to die out there, do you?" Before I could respond, we were ushered out of the room and into what appeared to be a large cafeteria. The smell of hot food made my stomach growl, reminding me how long it had been since we'd had a proper meal. As we ate, I scanned the room for familiar faces. I spotted Officer Reeves at a table with some other men from our group, deep in conversation. Dr. Chen was nowhere to be seen, which worried me. Marion appeared a short while later, looking as disoriented as I felt. She sat down next to me, her eyes darting around the room. "Have you seen the children?" she asked, her voice tight with concern. "They took them somewhere else. They won't tell us where." I felt a chill that had nothing to do with the temperature. Separating children from their parents seemed unnecessarily cruel, especially after what we'd all been through. As we finished our meal, a man in a crisp military uniform entered the cafeteria. The room fell silent as he cleared his throat to speak. "Welcome to Safe Haven," he began, his voice echoing in the quiet room. "You've all been through a terrible ordeal, but you're safe now. We're here to help you recover and adjust to your new lives." New lives? The phrase struck me as odd. It implied there was no going back, no hope of the world returning to normal. The officer continued, explaining that we would be assigned living quarters and jobs within the compound. He stressed the importance of following rules and cooperating with the staff. It all sounded reasonable on the surface, but there was an underlying tone of threat in his words. As we were led to our new living quarters, I managed to catch up with Officer Reeves. "What do you think?" I asked quietly. He shook his head slightly. "It's not what we hoped for, that's for sure. Keep your eyes open and your mouth shut for now. We need to figure out what's really going on here." Our living space was small but comfortable, a far cry from the frozen hell we'd left behind, but as I lay in my bunk that night, unable to sleep, I couldn't shake the feeling that we'd traded one kind of danger for another. The next few days were a blur of orientation sessions and medical checkups. We were given a crash course in the rules and structure of Safe Haven, but very little information about the world outside or how long we'd be staying. I was assigned to work in the hydroponics bay, helping to grow food for the compound. It was fascinating to see how they'd adapted to grow crops in this new frozen world, but it also made me wonder just how long they'd been preparing for this. During one of my shifts, I overheard two technicians talking in low voices. "The latest batch of samples is showing promising results," one said. "The exposure rates are higher higher than we anticipated. Good, the other replied. Maybe now we can move to the next phase. They noticed me then, and quickly changed the subject, but their words left me uneasy. What were they testing for? And what was this next phase they mentioned? I shared my concerns with Marion and Ray during our meal break. They'd had similar experiences, overhearing snippets of conversation that didn't quite add up. I saw them bringing in more survivors yesterday, Marion said, but they looked different, like they'd been out in the cold much longer than us. And the way the guards treated them, it was like they were specimens, not people. Ray nodded grimly. I've been talking to some of the other guys. No one's been allowed to leave the compound since we got here, not even the staff. It's like they're afraid of something out there, or maybe afraid of us getting out. As the days passed, more discrepancies began to surface. The official story we'd been told about the sudden freeze didn't match up with what we'd experienced, and there were areas of the compound that were strictly off limits, guarded day and night. About a week after our arrival, I finally managed to get a moment alone with Dr. Chen. She looked stressed, her usual calm demeanor cracking. They've been questioning me non-stop, she whispered, glancing around to make sure we weren't overheard. They're very interested in my theories about the unnatural nature of the freeze. I think they might know more about it than they're letting on. Her words confirmed my worst fears. This wasn't just a rescue operation. Something much bigger was going on. That night I was woken by a commotion in the hallway. Peering out of my room, I saw guards escorting a group of people I didn't recognize. They looked ill, their skin pale and waxy. As they passed, I caught a glimpse of strange ice-like formations on one man's arm. The next day, those people were nowhere to be seen, and no one would acknowledge the late-night disturbance. It was as if they'd never existed. I knew then that we had to find a way out. Whatever was happening in Safe Haven, it was clear that we were in danger, but escaping would be no easy task. The compound was locked down tight, and the frozen wasteland outside was just as deadly as ever. I began to gather a small group of trusted individuals, Marion, Ray, Dr. Chen, and a few others who shared our suspicions. We met in secret, sharing information and trying to piece together the truth. It was during one of these meetings that we had our breakthrough. Ray had managed to swipe an access card from one of the guards. It wouldn't get us out of the compound, but it would let us into some of the restricted areas. We decided to make our move that night. As the compound settled into its night cycle, our small group slipped out of our quarters. With Ray's stolen card, we made our way into a restricted section of the facility. The first thing we noticed was the drop in temperature. It was cold here, much colder than the rest of the compound. As we moved deeper into the restricted area, we came across laboratories filled with strange equipment. In one room, we found rows of tubes filled with a glowing blue liquid. In another, there were maps covered in notations showing the spread of the big freeze across the globe. But it was in the last room that we found the most chilling discovery. There, suspended in a massive tank, was a creature unlike anything I'd ever seen. It was vaguely humanoid, but its body was composed entirely of living ice. As we stared in horror at the creature, alarms began to blare. We'd been discovered. "Run!" I shouted, and our group scattered. As I raced through the corridors, my mind was reeling from what we'd seen. The creature in the tank, the maps, the experiments, it all pointed to one terrifying conclusion. The freeze hadn't been an accident. It had been engineered. I managed to make it back to my quarters, my heart pounding. I knew that come morning, everything would change. We had seen too much, learned too much. We were no longer survivors seeking refuge. We were liabilities. As I lay in my bunk, listening to the sounds of guards searching the compound, I realized that our fight for survival was far from over. We had escaped the frozen wasteland outside, only to find ourselves trapped in a different kind of hell. The truth about the freeze, about Safe Haven, about everything we'd been through, was far more terrifying than I could have imagined, and I knew that somehow we had to find a way to expose it, to stop whatever plan was in motion. But first, we had to survive the night, and as the sounds of the search grew closer, I steeled myself for what was to come. We had survived the Ice Age. Now, we had to survive those who had created it. The morning after our nighttime discovery brought a tense atmosphere to Safe Haven. Guards were everywhere, their eyes scanning faces, looking for any sign of guilt or knowledge. I tried to act normal, going about my usual routine in the hydroponics bay, but my mind was racing. I hadn't seen any of the others from our group since we scattered last night. I hoped they were safe, that they hadn't been caught. The not knowing was almost worse than anything else. As I tended to the plants, I overheard snippets of conversation between two guards nearby. "They're doing a full sweep of the compound," one said in a low voice. "Someone accessed restricted areas last night. Any idea who?" the other asked. "No," the first guard replied, "but they're determined to find out. I heard they're planning to interrogate everyone if they have to." My heart rate spiked at their words. We needed to act fast before they could round us up. But what could we do? We were trapped in this compound, surrounded by the deadly frozen wasteland outside. As I pondered our limited options, I noticed Dr. Chen enter the hydroponics bay. She looked calm, but I could see the tension in her eyes as she approached me. "We need to talk," she said quietly, pretending to examine one of the plants. "Meet me in the storage closet in 10 minutes. I nodded imperceptibly and she moved on. Those 10 minutes felt like an eternity as I finished my tasks, hyper-aware of every guard and camera around me. Finally, I made my way to the storage closet, slipping inside as casually as I could. Dr. Chen was already there, along with Marion and Ray. "We don't have much time," Dr. Chen said as soon as I closed the door. "They're closing in on us. We need to get out of here and we need to take evidence with us." "Evidence?" I asked, surprised. "How? And where would we go?" Ray spoke up. "I've been working on a plan. There's a supply convoy leaving tomorrow. If we can sneak onto one of the trucks, we might be able to get out." Marion nodded. "And I think I know how we can get the evidence. I've been assigned to the medical wing. I can access some of the files there." It was a risky plan with 1,000 ways it could go wrong, but we were out of options. We agreed to meet again that night to finalize the details. As we left the closet one by one, I couldn't shake the feeling that we were being watched. The compound suddenly felt like a trap ready to spring shut at any moment. The rest of the day passed in a blur of anxiety and forced normalcy. I went through the motions of my work, all while planning our escape in my head. That night, as I lay in my bunk pretending to sleep, I heard footsteps in the hallway. Voices spoke in hushed tones, and then I heard the sound of a door being opened forcefully. Someone was being taken. I held my breath, waiting to see if they would come for me next. But the footsteps receded, and silence fell once again. I didn't sleep at all that night. The next morning, rumors spread quickly. Several people had been taken for questioning during the night. No one had seen them since. As I made my way to the cafeteria for breakfast, I saw Officer Reeves. He looked haggard, his eyes darting around nervously. When he saw me, he gave a small shake of his head, a warning not to approach him. I felt a pang of guilt. We hadn't included Reeves in our escape plan, fearing he might try to stop us out of a sense of duty. Now, seeing him like this, I wondered if we had made a mistake. The day crawled by, each minute feeling like an hour as we waited for our chance. Finally, as evening approached, it was time to put our plan into action. Marion had managed to download files onto a small drive she had hidden in her shoe. Ray had scouted the loading docks and found our best route to the supply trucks. Dr. Chen had created a distraction in the lab, setting off alarms that would hopefully draw attention away from us. As chaos erupted from the lab area, we made our move. Racing through the corridors, we dodged guards and slipped past security checkpoints. We were almost at the loading docks when a shout rang out behind us. "Stop right there!" We ran faster, adrenaline pumping through our veins. I could hear footsteps pounding after us, getting closer with each second. We burst out onto the loading dock, the bitter cold hitting us like a wall. The supply trucks were there, engines idling. Without hesitation, we sprinted for the nearest one. Ray reached it first, yanking open the back doors. We piled in, pulling the doors shut just as guards appeared on the dock. We huddled in the darkness, hardly daring to breathe as we felt the truck start to move. Had we made it? Were we really escaping? As the truck rumbled out of the compound, a wave of relief washed over me. We had done it. We were out. But our relief was short-lived. As my eyes adjusted to the darkness, I realized we weren't alone in the truck. Huddled in the corner was a figure, watching us with wary eyes. It was Officer Reeves. "I thought you might try something like this," he said, his voice barely audible over the engine. "I couldn't let you go alone." I didn't know whether to feel relieved or worried by his presence. Could we trust him? Before we could discuss it further, the truck suddenly screeched to a halt. We heard shouting outside and then the sound of the driver's door opening and closing. "They must have realized we're gone," Marion whispered, fear evident in her voice. We held our breath, waiting. Would they search the truck? Had we come so far only to be caught now? Tense minutes passed. Then, to our immense relief, the truck started moving again. We had made it past the checkpoint. As we settled in for the long journey ahead, I couldn't help but wonder what we would find out there. The world we had left behind in New York seemed like a distant memory now. What had become of the rest of the country, the rest of the world in the grip of this engineered ice age? And what about the creature we had seen, that being of living ice? Was it the cause of all this, or just another victim of whatever sinister plan was in motion? As the truck rumbled on into the frozen night, I knew that our journey was far from over. We had escaped safe haven, but we were heading into a world that was anything but safe. With the evidence Marion had stolen and the knowledge we had gained, we now carried a tremendous responsibility. We had to find a way to expose the truth, to stop whatever was happening before it was too late. The Ice Age had changed everything, but now we knew it wasn't a natural disaster. It was a calculated act, a reshaping of the world for some purpose we didn't yet understand. And as we huddled together in the back of that truck, hurtling into an uncertain future, I realized that our fight for survival had become something much bigger. We were no longer just trying to stay alive. We were fighting for the future of humanity itself. As the hours passed, the monotonous rumble of the truck's engine became almost hypnotic. We took turns keeping watch, always alert for any sign that our escape had been discovered. The others tried to rest, but sleep was elusive in the cold, cramped space. I found myself staring at Officer Reeves, trying to gauge his intentions. He had been a leader back in the Empire State Building, someone we had all looked up to, but his presence here now felt like a wild card. "Why did you follow us?" I finally asked him, keeping my voice low. Reeves was quiet for a moment before responding. "I've seen too much, heard too much. Whatever's going on in that place, it's not right. I couldn't stand by and do nothing." His words should have been reassuring, but I couldn't shake my unease. Had he really come to help us, or was he here to monitor us to report back to safe haven? As dawn broke, painting the frozen world outside in pale light, the truck finally came to a stop. We held our breath, listening intently. We heard the driver's door open and close, footsteps crunching in the snow, then silence. "We should move," Ray whispered. "Find out where we are, figure out our next step." Cautiously, we opened the truck's rear doors. The sight that greeted us was both beautiful and terrifying. We were in a small town, or what was left of one. Every building, every street was encased in ice. It glittered in the early morning light, a crystalline graveyard of a world that no longer existed. As we climbed out of the truck, the cold hit us like a physical force. Even after all this time, it was still shocking how intense it was. We huddled together, our breath forming clouds in the frigid air. "We need to find shelter," Dr. Chen said, her teeth chattering. "Somewhere we can look at the files Marion grabbed and plan our next move." We moved quickly through the frozen town, our eyes scanning for any building that might offer protection from the cold. Most were too damaged by the ice, their structures compromised. But then we spotted it, a small library, its stone facade still mostly intact. Inside the library was a frozen time capsule, books lined shelves encased in ice, their pages forever unreadable. But it was shelter, and it was empty. We could work with this. As Ray and Reeves worked to secure the entrance, Marion pulled out the drive she had stolen. Dr. Chen produced a small tablet from her pack. She had managed to sneak it out of the compound. "Let's see what we've got," she said, her fingers trembling slightly as she connected the drive. What we found in those files was beyond our worst fears. Detailed plans for the intentional triggering of a global ice age, experiments on unwilling human subjects, testing their ability to survive in extreme cold, and at the center of it all, a project called Frozen Evolution. "They're trying to force the evolution of humanity," Dr. Chen whispered, her face pale as she read through the documents. "They believe that by subjecting us to these extreme conditions, they can trigger rapid adaptations, create a new form of human that can survive in this frozen world." The implications were staggering. The death toll from the freeze, the suffering of millions. It had all been intentional, part of some mad plan to reshape our species. "But why?" Marion asked, her voice shaking. "Why would they do this?" Before anyone could answer, a sound outside made us all freeze. Engines, multiple vehicles getting closer. "They found us," Reeves said, moving to the window to peer out. "We need to move now." But as we gathered our things, preparing to run once again, I couldn't shake the feeling that we were missing something crucial. The files, the experiments, the creature of living ice we had seen. How did it all fit together? As we slipped out the back of the library into the frozen wasteland that had once been a thriving town, I knew that we were carrying not just evidence, but the key to humanity's future. Somewhere out there, in this world of ice and snow, were answers, and we had to find them before those who had unleashed this frozen hell could complete their plan. The sound of vehicles grew louder behind us as we ran, our feet slipping on the icy ground. We were exposed, vulnerable in this open area. We needed to find cover to lose our pursuers in this frozen maze of a town. As we rounded a corner, I saw something that made my heart skip a beat. There, in the middle of the street, was a figure. Not human, not quite. Its body seemed to be made of the same living ice as the creature we had seen in the lab. It turned to look at us, its eyes glowing with an eerie blue light. And in that moment, I realized that our escape from safe haven had been just the beginning. The real battle for survival, for the future of our species, was only just starting. The ice creature stood motionless in the street, its crystalline body refracting the pale light. For a moment, we all froze, unsure whether to run or stand our ground. The sound of approaching vehicles grew louder behind us, leaving us caught between two unknown threats. Suddenly, the creature moved, but instead of attacking, it gestured for us to follow, then turned and glided away down an alley. We hesitated, exchanging uncertain glances. "We don't have a choice," Dr. Chen said urgently. "It's either trust this thing or face whatever's coming after us." With no better options, we followed the ice being through the frozen labyrinth of the town. It moved with uncanny grace, its body seeming to flow over the icy terrain. We struggled to keep up, our human limitations all too apparent in comparison. The creature led us to what appeared to be an old subway entrance. The stairs leading down were coated in ice, but the tunnel below promised shelter from both our pursuers and the biting cold. As we descended into the darkness, I couldn't help but think of our time in the Empire State Building. Once again, we were going underground to escape a frozen world, but this time, we were running from human monsters as much as natural ones. The subway tunnel was eerily quiet, the only sound our labored breathing and the soft scraping of the ice creature's movements. Our flashlights revealed abandoned train cars, frozen in time like everything else in this new world. We followed the creature deeper into the tunnel system, through twisting passages and cavernous stations. I lost all sense of direction, hoping that our strange guide knew where it was taking us. Finally, we emerged into a large open area that might once have been a maintenance depot. Here, to our amazement, we found others, humans like us, survivors of the freeze. But there were also more of the ice creatures, moving among the humans with apparent cooperation. An older man stepped forward, his weathered face a mask map of the hardships he'd endured. "Welcome," he said, his voice gravelly from disuse. "I'm Dr. Erickson. I see you've met one of our frostwalkers." We introduced ourselves, still wary but relieved to find other survivors. Dr. Erickson explained that this underground community had formed in the early days of the freeze, when he and a few others had discovered the true nature of the catastrophe. "The frostwalkers," he said, gesturing to the ice creatures. "They're not our enemies, they're victims just like us, products of the experiments that caused all this." Dr. Chen stepped forward, producing the tablet with the stolen files. "We have information," she said, "about Safe Haven, about the experiments, but there's still so much we don't understand." Dr. Erickson's eyes lit up at the mention of the files. He led us to a makeshift lab area, where we spent the next few hours poring over the data we'd brought. The picture that emerged was more complex and terrifying than we could have imagined. The global freeze hadn't been the end goal, but rather a means to an end. The true objective was to force rapid human evolution, to create a new species capable of thriving in this altered world. "The frostwalkers," Dr. Erickson explained, "are the result of early experiments, but they're not what the Safe Haven scientists ultimately want. They're aiming for something more, a perfect hybrid of human and ice being." As we digested this information, a commotion at the entrance to our sanctuary caught our attention. One of the human lookouts rushed in, his face pale with fear. "They've found us," he gasped. "Safe Haven forces, they're entering the tunnel system." Panic rippled through the group. We had just found this haven, and now it was about to be torn away from us. But Dr. Erickson remained calm. "We've prepared for this," he said, his voice steady. "We have escape routes, places to hide, but we need to split up. It's too dangerous for all of us to stay together." Quickly, groups were formed. I found myself with Marion, Ray, and one of the frostwalkers. Dr. Chen and Officer Reeves were assigned to another group. As we prepared to leave, Dr. Erickson approached me. "You've seen more of Safe Haven than most," he said, pressing a small device into my hand. "This contains coordinates to a place where we believe we can reverse the freeze. If we don't make it, it's up to you to find it." Before I could ask any more questions, we were ushered out through a hidden passage. The sound of boots on ice echoed through the tunnels behind us as we fled deeper into the underground maze. Our frostwalker guide moved silently ahead of us, its icy body blending seamlessly with our frozen surroundings. We followed as best we could, our human clumsiness a stark contrast to its fluid grace. After what felt like hours of twisting passages and narrow escapes, we emerged into the open air. The cold hit us like a physical blow after the relative warmth of the tunnels. We found ourselves in what had once been a suburban area, now a ghostly landscape of ice-entombed houses. "We need to keep moving," Ray said, his breath forming clouds in the frigid air. "They'll be searching this whole area." As we trudged through the frozen streets, I couldn't help but marvel at our frostwalker companion. It seemed completely unaffected by the cold, its icy body at home in this frozen world. I wondered what it must be like to be so perfectly adapted to an environment that was deadly to us. We took shelter in an abandoned house, its interior frozen in time like a macabre museum exhibit. As Marion and Ray worked to secure our temporary refuge, I found myself studying the device Dr. Erickson had given me. It was a simple GPS unit, but the coordinates it displayed pointed to a location far to the north, deep in what used to be Canada. What could be there? A way to reverse the freeze. It seemed too good to be true, but at this point, hope was all we had. As night fell, we huddled together for warmth, the frostwalker standing silent guard by the window. Sleep was fitful, interrupted by the constant cracking and groaning of the ice around us. I was jolted awake by a sound I'd hoped never to hear again, the rhythmic thump of helicopter blades. Safe Haven had air support, and they were getting closer. We rushed to gather our meager supplies, preparing to run once again. But as we reached the door, our frostwalker suddenly stiffened, its icy body crackling with tension. "What's wrong?" Marion asked, her voice tight with fear. The creature didn't respond, not that it could in any way we'd understand, but its meaning became clear a moment later when the door burst open, revealing a squad of heavily armed Safe Haven soldiers. Time seemed to slow as I took in the scene. The soldiers, their weapons trained on us. Ray and Marion, their faces masks of terror, and our frostwalker, its body beginning to glow with an inner light. What happened next was both beautiful and terrifying. The frostwalker seemed to explode, sending shards of living ice in all directions. The soldiers fell back, crying out in pain and surprise. In the chaos, we ran. We raced through the frozen streets, the sound of pursuit close behind us. The helicopter searchlight swept back and forth, turning night into day with stark, unforgiving light. As we ran, I realized our frostwalker was reforming, its scattered pieces flowing back together like mercury. It had sacrificed itself to save us, and now it was reborn. We were nearing the edge of the suburban area, the open wilderness of the frozen world stretching out before us. But with the helicopter above, we had nowhere to hide. Just when it seemed we were out of options, the ground beneath our feet began to rumble. Cracks appeared in the ice, spreading rapidly. The frostwalker gestured urgently for us to follow as it glided towards the forming fissure. Without time to think, we jumped. We slid down an icy tunnel, formed in the blink of an eye by forces I couldn't begin to understand. Above us, I heard the the frustrated shouts of the soldiers and the receding sound of the helicopter, we emerged into a cavern deep beneath the ice, a blue-tinged world of frozen beauty. And we weren't alone. More frostwalkers were there, dozens of them, their icy bodies illuminating the cave with a soft, ethereal glow. As we caught our breath, marveling at our surroundings, I realized that we had crossed a threshold. We were no longer just running from safe haven. We were now truly part of something bigger, a resistance against those who would reshape our world and our species without our consent. I pulled out the GPS unit, its screen glowing in the dim light of the ice cavern. The coordinates Dr. Erickson had given us now felt like more than just a destination. They were a mission, a purpose in this frozen world. Looking at Ray and Marion, at our Frostwalker allies, I knew that our journey was far from over. We had survived the first chaotic days of the Ice Age apocalypse. We had escaped the false sanctuary of Safe Haven. Now we faced our greatest challenge yet, a trek into the frozen heart of the continent, in search of a way to undo this man-made catastrophe. As we prepared for the long journey ahead, I couldn't help but wonder about the others. Dr. Chen, Officer Reeves, Dr. Erickson, all those we'd left behind. Had they escaped? Were they still fighting? But I pushed those thoughts aside. We had a mission now, a glimmer of hope in this frozen world. Whatever challenges lay ahead, whatever secrets we might uncover, we would face them together. Because in this new ice age, survival wasn't just about staying alive. It was about fighting for a future, for a world reborn from the ice. The Frostwalkers began to move, guiding us deeper into their underground realm. As we followed, stepping into the unknown, I realized that this was just the beginning of a new chapter in our struggle. The Ice Age had changed everything, but our will to survive, to thrive, to reclaim our world burned hotter than ever.